I'll be starting off by discussing some of the characters in this play. We will be starting off with John, or Jack, or as he's trying to be portrayed as Ernest. He is a responsible and respectable man, but he lives a double life. He lives in Hertfordshire. In Hertfordshire, he is known as Jack, but in London, he's known as Ernest, henceforth his double life. As a baby, Jack was discovered in a handbag in a cloakroom at the Victoria Station by an old man who adopted him and subsequently made him the guardian of his granddaughter, Cecily Cardew. Jack is in love with this certain woman who is his friend's cousin, and her name is Gwendolyn Fairfax. We will get to her momentarily. But first, let's move on to Algernon himself. His full name is Algernon Moncrief. He's charming, a bachelor, and nephew of Lady Bracknell, which is another character we will get into after this. Algernon is a brilliant man. He's witty. He's selfish, though. He has invented a fictional friend named Bunbury, whose frequent sudden relapses allow Algernon to wriggle out of unpleasant or dull social obligations. So moving on to Algernon's cousin, Gwendolyn Fairfax, again Jack's lover, who is also Lady Bracknell's daughter. Gwendolyn is in love with Jack, as I was saying. She only knows him as Ernest. She's very sophisticated, intellectual, and pretentious. And she also is fixated on the name Ernest and says she will not marry any man who is not named Ernest. Moving on to Cecily Cardew, which is the ward of Jack and the granddaughter of the old gentleman who rescued Jack. She is also obsessed with the name Ernest, though. This idea, rather than a virtuous-sounding name, has prompted her to fall in love with Jack's brother, Ernest. In her imagination, and to invent an elaborate romance and courtship between them. Now, moving on to Lady Bracknell, which is Algernon's snobbish aunt and Gwendolyn's mother. Lady Bracknell married into a wealthy man, and she wants the same thing done for her daughter. Lady Bracknell values ignorance, which she sees it as a delicate, exotic fruit. So, moving on to a character we have not named off yet, Miss Prism, Cecily's governess. She highly approves of Jack's presumed respectability. Despite her being rigidity, Miss Prism seems to have a softer side when she speaks of having once written a novel whose manuscript was lost. Also, she's entertained romantic feelings for Dr. Chasuble. Speaking of Dr. Chasuble, he's our next character. Reverend Canon Chasuble, the rector of Jack's estate. Both Jack and Algernon approached Dr. Chasuble to request that they would be christened Ernest. Dr. Chasuble entertains his secret feelings for Miss Prism. So moving on, we have the character Lane, Algernon's manservant. Lane is the only person who knows about Algernon's practice of Bunburying. Our final character is the smallest character out of all of them, and that would be Merriman, which is a butler at the manor house and Jack's estate in the country.
Okay, well, now that we have a brief overview of the characters, we can dive right into the plot overview. So Jack Worthing is known as kind of a pillar of the community in Hertfordshire. For years, he has also pretended to have an irresponsible kind of black sheep brother named Ernest, who leads a scandalous life in pursuit of pleasure and is always getting into trouble, requiring Jack to rush to his assistance. No one but Jack knows that he himself is Ernest. Jack, as stated before, is in love with Gwendolyn Fairfax, who is the cousin of his best friend, Algernon Moncrief. When the play opens, Algernon begins to suspect something. He has found an inscription inside of Jack's cigarette case addressed to Uncle Jack, from someone who refers to herself as Little Cecily. Algernon suspects that Jack may be leading a double life. At the beginning of Act 1, Jack drops in unexpectedly on Algernon and announces that he intends to propose to Gwendolyn. Algernon confronts him with a cigarette case and forces him to come clean, demanding to know who Jack and Cecily are. Jack confesses that that his name isn't really Ernest and that Cecily is his ward. Jack says he's been thinking of killing off his fake brother since Cecily has been showing too active an interest in him. Without meaning to, Jack describes Cecily in terms that catch Algernon's attention. Gwendolen and her mother, Lady Bracknell, arrive, which gives Jack an opportunity to propose to Gwendolen. Jack is delighted to discover that Gwendolen returns his affections, but he is alarmed to learn that Gwendolen is fixated on the name Ernest. She says that it inspires absolute confidence and she refuses to marry any man whose name is not Ernest. Lady Bracknell then interviews Jack to determine whether or not he is a eligible son-in-law and husband to her daughter, and during this interview she asks about his family background. As stated before, Jack was found in a handbag and adopted by an elderly man. When Lady Bracknell finds out about this, she forbids the match between Jack and Gwendolen and sweeps out of the house. In Act 2, Algernon shows up at Jack's country estate posing as Jack's brother Ernest. Meanwhile, Jack, having decided that Ernest has outlived his usefulness, arrives home in deep mourning, full of story about Ernest having died suddenly in Paris. He is enraged to find Algernon there masquerading as Ernest, but has to go along with the charade, otherwise his own lies and deceptions will be revealed. Algernon falls hopelessly in love with Cecily and asks her to marry him. Algernon, posing as Ernest, is then surprised to discover that Cecily had already considered that they are engaged. Algernon is less enchanted to learn that part of Cecily's interest in him derives from the name Ernest, which she, just as Gwendolen, says inspires absolute confidence. Algernon goes off in search of Dr. Chasuble to see about getting himself christened as Ernest. Meanwhile, Gwendolen arrives, having decided to pay Jack an unexpected visit. And by Jack, of course, I mean Ernest. Gwendolen is shown into the garden where Cecily orders tea. Cecily has no idea how Gwendolen kind of fits into Jack's life or who she is, and Gwendolen similarly has no idea who Cecily is, and soon learns that she is Mr. Worthing's ward. She notes that Ernest has never mentioned having a ward, and Cecily explains it is not Ernest Worthing who is her guardian, but his brother Jack, and she is engaged to be married to Ernest Worthing. Gwendolen points out that this is impossible because she is engaged to Ernest Worthing. Jack and Algernon arrive toward the climax of this confrontation. Each of the young ladies points out that the other has been deceived. The two women demand to know where Jack's brother Ernest is, since both of them are engaged to be married to him. Jack is forced to admit that he has no brother and that Ernest is a complete fiction. Act 3 takes place in the drawing room of the manor house. When Jack and Algernon enter from the garden, the two women confront them. Cecily asks Algernon why he pretended to be her guardian's brother. Algernon tells her he did it in order to meet her, and Gwendolen asks Jack whether he pretended to have a brother in order to come into London to see her as often as possible, and she interprets his evasive reply as an affirmation. The women are somewhat appeased, but still concerned over the issue of the name. However, when Jack and Algernon tell Gwendolen and Cecily that they have both made arrangements to be christened Ernest that afternoon, all is forgiven and the two pairs of lovers embrace. Lady Bracknell has followed Gwendolen from London. Gwendolen again informs Lady Bracknell of her engagement to Jack, and Lady Bracknell reiterates that a union between them is out of the question. Algernon tells Lady Bracknell of his engagement to Cecily, prompting her to inspect Cecily, which she does in a patronizing manner, which then makes Jack very angry. He replies to all of Lady Bracknell's questions with sarcasm, withholding until the last possible moment the information that Cecily is actually worth a great deal of money and stands to inherit more when she comes of age. Jack informs Lady Bracknell that, as Cecily's legal guardian, he refuses to give consent to her union with Algernon. Lady Bracknell suggests that the two young people simply wait until Cecily comes of age, and Jack points out that under the terms of her grandfather's will, Cecily does not legally come of age until she is 35. Lady Bracknell asks Jack to reconsider, and he points out that the matter is entirely in her own hands. As soon as she consents to his marriage to Gwendolen, Cecily can have his consent to marry Algernon. However, Lady Bracknell refuses to entertain the notion. She and Gwendolen are on the point of leaving when Dr. Chasuble arrives and happens to mention Cecily's governess, Miss Prism. When the governess Ernest arrives and sees Lady Bracknell, she begins to look kind of guilty. Lady Bracknell accuses her of having left her sister's house 28 years before with a baby and never returned. She demands to know where the baby is now. Miss Prism confesses that she doesn't know, explaining that she lost the baby, having kind of absent-mindedly placed it in a handbag, maybe, in which she had meant to place the manuscript for a novel she had written. Jack asks what happened to the bag, and Miss Prism says she left it in the cloakroom of a railway station. It takes a while before the situation is sorted out, but before too long we understand that Jack is not the illegitimate child of Miss Prism, but the legitimate child of Lady Bracknell's sister, and therefore Algernon's older brother. Jack had been originally christened Ernest John. All these years, Jack has unwittingly been telling the truth. Ernest is his name, as is Jack, and he does have an unprincipled younger brother, Algernon, and Jack acknowledges that he now understands the vital importance of being earnest. There are multiple themes throughout the play, and we're going to talk about a few of them. The first being somewhat of dual identities. This duality idea is obviously present in Algernon and Jack because Algernon has a fake friend named Bunbury that he uses to get out of social situations, and Jack obviously has his alternate identity being Ernest. And then we see later that Algernon also adopts this alternate identity to kind of meet Cecily and then later fall in love with her. But we also kind of see this sort of dual identity in other characters, such as Cecily, who writes correspondence between herself and Ernest before she has ever even met him. She has sort of created this love and passion and engagement for this man that she had never met.
Linked to the theme of the double life is that of life as a fiction or a work of art. Oscar Wilde was an exponent of the aesthetic movement, which promoted the idea that purpose of art was to create beauty rather than educate or to present a moral ideal. Algernon and Cecily create their fictions largely as acts of imagination. Neither of them identify with their fictions. It is significant that Miss Prism substituted her novel for Baby Jack. This is a symbolic way of saying that Jack's whole life has been a fiction. Gwendolyn, for her part, would rather believe a fiction than her own reality. She invents a self-serving reason on why Jack deceived her and supplies it to him, without wanting to know his real motives. Thus, Jack and Gwendolyn, their aim is not to create works of beauty and imagination, but to deceive themselves or others.